it's because of the people that come up to me and say, hey, I saw your photos there. I want to go there now. Or, hey, can you tell me how to get there? Because I want to connect to that. I want to see that. And I just think, that just makes me feel amazing. Right? And my friends, my family, I love trying to, pass that stuff on to them too, because I think the more of us that are out there connected, understand, the better the future for our country, the better the future for the planet will be.
Hi and welcome to Wonder, the Planet Earth podcast for curious people. I'm Holly Cook, joined as always by fellow Earth scientist Dr. Anthony Reid, and we have Dr. Steve Hill again. How are you, Steve?
Hi, Holly. Hi, Anthony. Long-time listener, first-time guest.
That's what we love. So, Steve, we have had a conversation with you now about Australia, like Australian landscapes, basically. What do they even mean? The mosaic of time that Australian landscapes can represent. My question that I'm still percolating, and I'd like to talk to you about it, is what does it mean for Australians to inhabit Australian landscapes? And I know that sounds a bit maybe faffy, but what I'm trying to ask is why should it be a thing at all that we understand the landscapes around us?
That's a great question, Holly. It's not faffy. I think it represents our biggest societal and human challenge, and that is how we understand and connect with our planet. And the way that we do that is by understanding and connecting with our landscapes or our country, that the bit that we actually live with. I'm a big advocate for the geological and environmental science of everything between fresh rock and fresh air. So the weathered rocks, the sediments, the groundwaters, but also the plants, the animals, the gases, all those things. We have to live with that. And so, and that everything we need for our life comes from that. And so what's the prize here, or what's the value proposition? It's our home. It's our bit of, I'll be a bit parochial here and I'll say as Australians, but it could be any other country in the world, we have responsibility for a bit of the earth. And that's what sustains us as people, and everything we share our planet with, the flora, the fauna, everything else as well. Right? It's not just about people being everywhere. And that is the biggest fundamental challenge. That's what countries go to war about. That's what people starve about, starve for and fight for and live for and die for and all those things. It is about our connection to country. And so we have, as scientists, a role to play there, and we have things to bring into that conversation and that evidence-based advice around those landscapes and that country that we live with.
Amazing, Steve. This is something you've been passionate about for a long time. Can you just take us a little bit back to what triggered your personal, your own personal kind of reflection on this and your journey a little bit through?
Yeah, I've always loved, being outdoors and traveling and going into landscapes. So, as a kid, my parents were terrific in getting us out, camping, traveling around, and I loved that. They were my favorite times. The family's all relaxed, everyone's in it together and we're exploring new things and all of that. I think that's great. But there was also a lot of learning about places, and I'm very place orientated, Anthony, so working at Geoscience Australia, which is the government department in Australia around the earth, and the Department of Where is a perfect fit for me, because it's usually my first question is where.
Where am I? Where are we?
I see beautiful photos. It's like, I wish I knew where that was, because it would help me understand it. So I've always had that. I've really had that, but I never knew that there were jobs in it. I never knew that there was a career. So I sort of, floundered my way through school and university, and then didn't leave university, went on and did a PhD. So I did an honours project down at Wilson's Promontory, which is the most southern tip of the Australian mainland. I loved it. It was just one of the best years of my life, where I had license to really connect and walk around that place and make discoveries of, continental dune fields from when there was a land bridge between Victoria and Antarctica. That was a big part of it. One of my supervisors was Jim Bowler, the famous geologist that found the Lake Mungo remains and things. He was over the moon that this kid had found all these things, but it was an amazing year. And then I went on and did a PhD because I still didn't quite know that there was a job and what I could do with it all. And I worked out at Broken Hill.
Yep.
And it was amazing. You know, one of the world's most famous ore deposits and one of the most mapped geological parts of Australia still didn't have a coherent understanding of its landscape.
Oh, doesn't surprise me. And
Right.
but the way it was discovered was some bloke riding on a horse and went to the top of the hill, right?
That's right. You know,
So
it's like-
landscape was intimately associated with discovery and the preservation and discovery of the deposit.
That's right. In fact, the irony is that the Broken Hill ore body used to be referred to, before it was known as the ore body that it was called the Hill of Mullock, which kind of is a bit like Anthony Reid calling these things dirt. You know, it was
offensive,
it was a term of contempt. You know, this was
Just
rubbish.
you know, Anthony Reid doesn't talk about dirt anymore. Anthony Reid has learned his lesson.
He doesn't know dirt.
But
So you did a PhD.
So I worked out there. That was amazing. That then really got me connected to the Western New South Wales landscape. So Tibooburra and all those parts. And then I started to move around a bit in my work and got a lecturing job at the University of Canberra, where I had students. And so some of the students continued working out in Western New South Wales, but others eventually were working in places like the Tanami Desert. And then I became an academic at University of Adelaide. And, I had PhD students working all around the country, really trying to add that understanding to landscapes that will help us better live with them. And that could be for exploring for mineral resources. It could be for groundwater work, even for, soil quality and just that data and information. And a big part of what I did was mapping. Mapping is something that you don't see a lot of people out boots on the ground mapping anymore, right? And one of the things about mapping is it's a very honest pursuit because you can't cherry pick. You've got to actually cover the entire surface. That's actually challenging.
It's a challenge.
There's some bits we don't understand and don't like, and we like to be able to sort of push them to the side of our plate with our, Brussels sprouts.
Yeah. And I don't doubt for a second that you have seen stacks of the surface of the Australian continent, but the proof is in the pudding. I'm going to ask you I caught a glimpse of this on your iPad. So what Steve's going to do, he knows exactly what I'm going to ask him. What Steve's going to do is pull up a map on his photo album, which basically locates has locations of all the images taken. Can you please look at this? What is going on here? So this is all the places that you've stopped and taken a photo of the Australian landscape.
Yeah. So
Steve, this is insane.
So this is one of my big obsessions. And the interesting thing is it's very much linked to my job, but I'm not actually paid to do this. This is what I do on weekends. And I live in Adelaide and my work base is in Canberra. So I commute. And I drive a lot of the time because I like to have a car at each end so I can bust out and look at things. And this image here is your typical, iPhoto image that shows, your geotagged photos. I love it that we now take photos and they're geotagged.
Yeah.
Right? But the thing about this is as you zoom in, it starts to show even more of these things popping up and, the different back roads that I take. Every time I do the drive, I go a different way. Let's go around Canberra and you can see what I get up to on weekends.
Oh my God.
So,
look at that waterfall.
In this area and then, just the more you zoom in, the more that just keeps coming up. And I am totally obsessed about this and I spend my spare time looking at the gaps.
Yeah.
Why haven't I been in there? And it actually came about for me during COVID. When I realised that I thought I'd been there, done that and whatever, but I couldn't go to these places. So I wanted to look at my photos and work out what I could write up and what I could sort of use. I realised that I didn't have as much coverage as I thought I did.
I hadn't actually been there. Yeah.
Steve, why do you want to go to these? No sorries. It's a very deep in your heart thing, I can tell. Why do you want to go to places you haven't seen before in this country?
Yeah. So in the first part, it's because I work for Geoscience Australia, and that is the Australian government, and we provide, scientific data, advice, evidence of the Australian continent. And I feel that my role as chief scientist there, I think it really pays for me to be connected to as many parts of the Australian continent firsthand. And I use it all the time. People will talk to me about things that are going on, and I love to be able to automatically make a picture of where it is, what that means, what it's like. And it gets back to that connection to country. We talk about it with First Nations people, Indigenous people, and how there is a connection to country. You know, we're welcome to country, or we acknowledge country, and we talk about the connection. And we also see it with people that live in the country, you know, farmers and so forth. And that's because they're living their livelihoods and they live with that country all the time. But the reality is, even in the cities, in government, in industry, whatever it may be, we still have to live with that country. And the big thing for me is about, you know, a nation that loses its connection to its country, either culturally, emotionally, or scientifically, loses. You know, so this is our bit of that earth that I talked about earlier, that bit of the earth that we look after. So this is, you know, I try to use my time to when I can't be with my family and I can't be in the office, I want to
be with your country.
and be with the country.
And
Yeah.
what made you take that change in direction from an academic, you know, university lecturer into a government organisation?
Yeah, it was weird for me. All I wanted was tenure at a university. You know, I wanted that security, and I loved it. You know, I loved teaching.
Yeah.
And I always had a really strong group of students, the most amazing people. I loved the students that I had, that I worked with. And the bit that the real cause that I had there was to teach the future generations how to read landscapes and understand landscapes, because it's not traditionally taught in geology courses in a big way. There's a bit of, you know, geography, you know, physical geography or geomorphology, but there's not that. It's not really taken from that strong geological science perspective. And so I knew that I was on something a bit unique, you know, that was unique, and I wanted to make sure
it had a contribution to make, actually.
I think it still does, you know. But what I realized, as good as that was, there was a little bit of Groundhog Day in it. You know, there was a sort of, you know, starting again every year and everything. And I felt that I had an opportunity to perhaps have more impact.
Yeah.
And so the opportunity came up to become the director of the South Australian Geological Survey. And it's like, wow, we start to do this science to make decisions and impact that informs the state, which then informs the people and the industry that work with that. And that was an amazing opportunity.
And I can see you extended that from the state level into the federal level, the national organisation. And one of the things I always love to see on any social media that's coming from Steve Hill is when he's taken a group of politicians or visiting dignitaries underground beneath Parliament House to look at the geology. I just think that's incredible, Steve.
That's one of those impactful privileges I've got, and that is to be able to take, you know, members of the public, but, you know, ministers, people that are elected
making decisions
democratically to make decisions and lead our country, to actually, you know, give them that little tap about, hey, you know, you're in Parliament House, it's a beautiful building, but let's actually think about the fact that this is part of the landscape. It's part of the Murray-Darling catchment. You know, it's amazing. They're making decisions about Murray-Darling catchment.
Thinking the Murray-Darling catchment is something else.
It's out back somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, outback. It's out there. Outback. It's such a dismissive term, you know.
You're actually in it.
But they're actually in it, right? And we're in it. And what we do on those tours, you know, I work with my colleagues Verity Normington and Louise Soroka at Geoscience Australia, and we go under the building and we look at the rocks that are in there, and there's amazing geological relationships that just tell an incredible story. And how good is it to have our, you know, politicians walk away from that and realise that, hey, you know, our earth, our geology is such an integral part of our lives. It's even right here at Parliament House.
So what is that? So, okay, this is rogue, but whatever. What is actually then seated under Parliament? Because I sort of think I've really taken home your comment that landscapes are continuing. I imagine, for example, your comment about gold nuggets in the ancient river landscape, in the ancient river sediments. I was thinking, well, humans are now continuing the landscape because we're putting the gold in our pockets and we're actually relocating the gold elsewhere for in 100 million years' time. It's not going to be in that river anymore. It will be wherever humans have scattered it. In the same way, when, you know, in millions of years' times, maybe there's going to be a bit of cement left over from Parliament House. So, like, what will today's society at Australian Parliament House, what stratigraphy, what collection of rocks will it be seated above? What is under that Parliament House?
Stratigraphy of Parliament House.
Yeah.
No jokes about, you know.
No, very serious, please.
Serious question. So you're asking about what's the potential geological preservation and record of modern day Parliament House?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
What's it sitting above?
Oh, so what it's sitting on is it's sitting on Silurian, so, you know, 430 million year old rocks that were deposited as sediment on the seafloor. And this was in the very early stages of the Pacific Ocean forming. And, we're sort of on that margin of the Pacific. The land of what is now Australia really didn't get started until you were further west at Broken Hill, those old bits of craton. But you can see those seafloor sediments, and you can see fossils in them. And, there's the ACT fossil emblem, which is a trilobite, is actually found out of those rocks. But the key thing there is at Parliament House is that the particular rocks that are under Parliament House, that rock relationship was very important to understanding the geology and the landscape of the area, and it's not exposed anywhere else. So it's really important to see that. The other thing that comes through is that those rocks then form the main hills and valleys around Canberra, and that's what Canberra was designed and surveyed on. So it's actually a city that was designed around the Molonglo River, which became the lake, Burley Griffin, but Mount Ainslie, Red Hill, Black Mountain, those peaks. And so they're all part of that landscape, and that was integral to the design of Canberra. So even there, the design of our cities is built on a knowledge of landscape.
And actually on that point about cities, so another thing I've been thinking about, Steve, so we say that humans live in the landscape, and I think we could push it and say humans are of the landscape, because if you picked us up and put us on Mars, that's not where humans live. Humans can live in the landscapes that are amenable to our lives today, and part of what is amenable to our lives today is the structure of cities, is cement, it is concrete, it is housing. But just because we have eliminated the natural environment that was there doesn't mean we're not beholden to it anymore. So how are Australian cities, do you think about this?
Oh yeah, all the time. And that idea that every city is built on a landscape, and those landscapes may sometimes be paved and landscaped, covered.
Yeah.
But every now and then they'll rear their head, and you'll get flooding, you'll get an earthquake, you'll get fires, and things like that will happen. And that's the landscape reminding us that, I'm here, you're living here, and those processes can still affect us. And the other really cool thing is chemically, you have a chemical signature in you, Holly, that reflects your place, because the food you eat, the water you drink, the dust that's under your fingernails, all those things builds that chemical signature. And this is another part of the connection to landscapes that I'm also very, very passionate about, where I did a lot of research with students where we were looking at saying, okay, so we have this understanding of landscape, but how far can we really extend that? And what we started to test was, can we actually take the leaves from the trees, the soil from a termite mound, the little ants that are around, and even kangaroo poo, and chemically analyze them to tell us about our landscape and potentially even what lies beneath the landscape. And that's what we were able to do. The Australian flora and fauna has an amazing story about our landscape as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love if we can, not too much, I suppose, because there's so much more to get through. But on that point about landscape living inside of you, so it's one thing to walk through landscapes, but that the signature of the landscape becomes encoded in its constituents in a sense. So what do you mean flora and fauna? But tell me about that.
So we did a lot of work on the chemical composition of very widespread Australian trees. So things like river red gums, mulga, spinifex, a whole lot of trees like that. Cool. And we started to look at the chemical composition of them. And the great news is they vary. And they vary for a whole lot of reasons. But one of the main reasons they vary is because of the substrate they grow in, the soil they grow in, and the rocks that are underneath and the waters that they interact with. And so we can use that then as a code, sort of decoding what the environmental chemistry is like in an area. And then we moved on to animals. Termites, they burrow down to the water table and make these mounds. Ants do similar sort of thing. And the idea with the kangaroo poo is the kangaroos are eating the grass that's cycling these chemical signatures from the landscape. Then they're macerating it, and then they're
concentrating it up in some way,
secreting it out as these little pellets. And you go around the landscape and you put your gloves on and you pick them up, and then you dry them out and analyze them. And they're telling you the same thing. The kangaroo poo around Broken Hill, in fact, has signatures of the ore body in that area. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing. And
Get
the
out of
kangaroos,
here.
they've done a lot of radio tracking of the range of the kangaroos. They have a sort of 5 kilometre or so home range. It varies in seasonally and all that, but generally the kangaroos are picking up these sort of 5 kilometre zoned footprints of the environmental chemistry that's kind of amalgamated. But the reason is, this work, it sounds funny, it sounds crazy.
It's awesome.
But it's actually about saying, if we really are all part of this landscape, and this landscape is what lives in us and the other, the flora and fauna and everything else that we share the planet with, let's test whether that's true. And you see it in these results. And people are using those things now to search for fresh water underground. You can pick up the salinity gradients in the Murray River and groundwater using the river red gums, the chemistry in them. Spinifex, amazing. It sends its roots down over 50 metres.
The spinifex grass is incredible.
This little 1 metre grass.
Are we talking about the grass that gives you shards?
The spiky
that
one.
Spiky one.
Really
Very-
prickly, right?
Am I hearing that it's cool?
It's amazing. It drills down 50 metres. It lives for hundreds of years.
Oh my gosh.
It doesn't invest above the ground because it all burns and it dries out. In fact,
It invests below the Australian
below,
surface.
and that's why it outlasts so many things. That's why it's so tough. But it actually will carry signatures. We looked at it in the Tanami, and it was carrying signatures from 30 to 50 metres below the surface into those plants. And we'd go and pick the plants. That's not an easy job. My student Nathan Reed did a lot of that work, and I worked with him, and Anna Petz as well.
Yeah.
Was working out there on those things. And we'd come back from the field and we'd have all these prick marks in our forearms, and you'd go into a shop and people
would be like,
what are they doing? Pushing a little button under the counter.
Yeah.
it's not what you think.
Yeah. But it's just amazing, right? And there's still so much that we don't know and understand that, it's a frontier and that we've got a long way to go on. But what's exciting about it is it shows that our relationship with our country is still in its early stages. And there's so much opportunity there. It's just great.
One of the pictures I'd love it if we could have a chat to about that connection and your experience out in Western New South Wales is this absolutely iconic photograph you have of one of these special mulga trees. I think that's the one there, which you'll pull.
Oh my
So it's
gosh.
a beautiful. It's a
Love it.
sunset, I imagine.
Yeah, it is. It's the
It's like
old
a reddish-
Mundy.
Mundy. So it's the sort of western side of Broken Hill.
Yeah.
The
It's-
tree is gnarled and twisted. It's one of these types of trees that is, you see it as you're speeding past 100 k's an hour. But when you actually stop and talk to these trees, so to speak, you realise just how twisted and how ancient and how hardy these things are to survive out there year after year through epic droughts and occasional flooding rains, right?
That was beautiful.
It's I'm just trying to praise the mulga. I love these things. But please tell us about this image, Steve.
Yeah, so this is on the edge of the Mundy Plains. So near Broken Hill, Silverton. You go a little bit further west. It's a famous area. Australian movies
Love this
go
area.
out there all the time. Priscilla and
Mad Max did something.
Mad
out there.
Max,
Yeah.
Oh.
Wake in Fright.
Yeah.
All the
Great
classics.
movies. All
yeah.
of those. They're all out there, right?
It's an iconic landscape, actually. And is that there's a line of low hills running through the centre part of it. Now, that is coming off of those hills down into the plain. So we're standing on the plain looking back towards the
right.
hills. So
There's a big fault line on the edge of those hills called the Mundy Fault, where the hills have been uplifted and quite recently as well as old. The hills are old, but they continue
Also
to be
new.
rejuvenated.
yeah. So I always found driving towards the edge, just you're kind of winding your way through hills and valleys, and then all of a sudden, it like the landscape drops away and it's just flat forever. It seems going on.
These flat areas, they're my favourites. I love the hills.
flat
They're
areas
great.
are
But
your
the flat
favourite?
areas, the ones that people think are boring, there's nothing like a plain to really get your mind
Twist
going.
your mind.
right?
Yeah. So okay, because I have wondered this.
Yeah.
Why are they so flat?
Yeah. We spend our time worrying about how mountains get pushed up and we think that's amazing. But how did these plains form extensively
So
flat, right? And you think about it, they're almost an oxymoronic landform because to form a plain, it's easy to say, oh, well, they formed from either erosion or from sediment buildup, right? Let's just take the erosion path, right? If they form from erosion, the reality is the areas that erode the most typically are the areas that are mountainous and high relief.
The ones. Yep.
The closer you get to a plain, the less they erode. So how do they form such perfect plains? And a lot of that comes back to the antiquity and stability of Australia. But there's also other driving forces like the level, a lot of these plains, they will blend out or grade out to the level of the sea.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of these plains go back to the time of the inland seas. Some of these ones here will just go out to like lake levels, Lake Frome and things like that out to the west of Broken Hill. But getting back to your original question, Anthony, there's so many questions out there.
So good.
This twisty mulga, I love it. And this twisty mulga would be well over 100 years old. So and in fact, probably even more. And it really goes back to many of the mulga stands in this part of the world are actually disappearing. Because if you have a look at that scene, there's no little baby mulga being recruited.
Where's the baba?
Where's the baby? And the reality is this tree's producing plenty of seed. But the thing is, you've got things like rabbits, kangaroos, sheep,
Goats.
But the rabbits are the big one, right?
Mm.
And they have decimated the seedling recruitment. And I think, Steve, why are you talking about plants and that?
Mm.
The reality is then is that that's all part of the landscape. That is changing how chemical elements are being cycled. The periodic fires can no longer be sustained because there's not enough biomass. The soil levels in some areas will be decreased, and that'll wash down. In other areas, the soil will be building up and burying things, right? Where it's being decreased, which is typically where the mulga grows, because they grow sort of on the upper slopes, more neutral soils, the soil levels are being depleted, which means the soils hold less water.
Mm.
The ability of these things to survive drought then becomes less. And so they're not only not producing viable offspring, but they're under threat themselves.
Mm.
I think that one day we'll go out to this area and we'll read about these mulga trees and we'll think, I wish a stump.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just think, arid zone landscapes.
Absolutely fascinating.
And they cover 80% or, a big percentage of our continent.
Mm-hmm.
And they're kind of a little bit out of sight, out of mind. And this gets back to the connection, the understanding and appreciation. This is truly beautiful and an amazing place that tells great stories about the environmental history. So, yeah.
Oh, wow. So then to your point about out of sight, out of mind, what would be the message you send? Because I would imagine that we have a healthy Australian listenership. I would imagine that most of us sort of live our lives on those coastal edges with a bit of an out of sight, out of mind mentality. I have two questions, Steve. One, specifically with arid zone areas, you just said arid areas, 80% of the country. Why do they matter to non-arid areas? Why do they matter to our lives on separate to them? Why do they matter to our lives on the coast? Do they, if they?
Yeah.
And secondly, what's your advice for helping people read landscapes or at least try and get out there and feel this connection that we speak about? Because I don't want to assume that it's almost a skill set being able to connect in a sense.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I'd like to hear that from you.
So arid areas, in fact, all areas, the landscapes matter because they are the home for us and they've been the home for people for thousands of years, and we hope that continues for thousands of years more. They're also the home for flora and fauna and other beings, so they do matter. And the other thing about them is that really, there's a little bit like when you drive down the street and you see a house that's looked after and a garden that's looked after, and you think that's great to see. And you see ones that aren't. You think, as a nation, we need to look after our yard, our place, and that includes the arid zones. And the more that we connect with them and understand them, the more we find they hold so much wonder, but so much of the key to our ongoing life and existence in this country. They host so many of our mineral resources, our energy resources, our beautiful sunlight for solar, all those things, but also the water and farming. It's marginal, but if we can be smarter and better, then maybe some of those things also start to pop out. So no, they're incredible places and they're beautiful and they tell the story of us and our continent. Now, what was your second?
My second one is, how do you, with all of our chat around connection to country, do you have parting words for how people can go and feel that?
Of Steve Woolworth.
Correct.
Folks, get amongst it. Get out there.
Get around it.
Get there. And That's true. Like the main reason, so I have an Instagram page, Steve O Geo.
It's the best Instagram page ever.
Nice.
It's very kind. But really, I often wonder, why am I doing this? And it's like, it's because of the people that come up to me and say, hey, I saw your photos there. I want to go there now. Or, hey, can you tell me how to get there? Because I want to connect to that. I want to see that. And I just think, that just makes me feel amazing. All right. And my friends, my family, I love trying to, pass that stuff on to them too, because I think the more of us that are out there connected, understand, the better the future for our country, the better the future for the planet will be. Because, you can't, it's difficult to look after something that you don't understand and are not connected with. And that's really, through our science, through our culture, and really just through our, kind of participation and just being, I think they're the opportunities that we have. And that's, it goes back to why I love being an earth scientist or a geoscientist. I love talking about geoscience in a very broad sense because it includes the earth, all of the earth stuff. And Geoscience Australia, that's the kind of Australian team for doing that. So
fantastic.
That's what I think it's about. But everyone, get out there.
Completely. Steve, thanks for your time. It's been actually a really special series of chats with you. So
thank you.
Really thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thanks, Steve.